Yeah, so we're starting. Great. So welcome everyone to our second seminar of the center in the context of our seminar series on strengthening democracy and research practice exchange. My name is Seren Ercan and I am the director of the center and I will be moderating today's seminar. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. It's good to see so many people participating today here, our participants as well. So welcome everybody. I would like to remind that this seminar is recorded and I hope that this is fine with everybody. The idea is then to make the recorded seminar available to rewatch on our center's YouTube channel. In democratic practice, does research matter? This is the question we will be discussing today, together with two speakers who bring rich insights and experience from both academic and practical perspectives. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Max Grömping and Dr. Alex Fischer. Max Grömping is senior lecturer in the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. He studies the dynamics of policy lobbying and advocacy under different political regimes and how information disorder affects citizens' trust in political institutions. Max has been involved in many projects focusing on the problems of democracy and seeking solutions to those problems. We also have very happy to have with us today Dr. Alex Fischer, who is Senior Advisor to the Department of Home Affairs, Office of Community Cohesion, and a member of the Australia Resilient Democracy Research and Data Network as well. Alex is an interdisciplinary scholar and practitioner with expertise in global environmental security, social policy, and institutional design. His work, both as a researcher and practitioner, seeks to translate novel research and insights into actionable ideas which inform policy and enable democratic innovators. So the seminar is designed as a conversation rather than our speakers presenting papers. And we have around half an hour for the speaking section, and this will be followed by the Q&A from the room as well as from our participants online. So I will be asking some questions to each of our speakers for about 10 minutes, and then I will invite them to ask one question to each other, and then after that we will open the floor. I would like to start with Max. Max, welcome to our center.
Thank you.
I know that you're doing lots of very interesting research on democracy, and your work has been very inspiring for me as well. You study democracy in liberal democratic contexts, but also in other authoritarian contexts. So you have lots of insights on what it means to study democracy. So I want to ask you to briefly tell us, what does it mean to study democracy? And what do you focus on in your research when you study democracy? And what kind of practical impact you hope your research will have?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, first of all, for the kind invitation, Selen. Legal system, then you can potentially design interventions to help people overcome disinformation, help policymakers design regulation that can tackle it and so forth. So that's in the long run the impact I hope to make, I suppose.
So you are working on an ARC project at the moment together with your colleagues on a topic related to Australian democracy. Can you tell us a bit about that project? What are you researching there when it comes to Australian democracy?
Yeah, so the project is a 5-year project, an ARC discovery grant called Mapping and Harnessing Public Mistrust. We're in the 2nd year now of this project, and we're conducting a large survey of the Australian public as we speak. the project focuses on how we can institutionalize what we call skeptical mistrust, which is a quality of a quality of trust that is very important in a democracy. So, trust is good for democracy, and cynical distrust is probably bad when people start not trusting the system or the institutions, but a bit of a skeptical variety of it is actually normatively good. So how can we institutionalize it? And we focus specifically on the role of guardrail institutions. Those are things like election commissions or anti-corruption commissions. And in this big survey that we have in the field now, we ask people their perception of these institutions, and we test whether certain interventions of these institutions, when they hold politicians to account, whether that repairs trust in people who have lost it.
I mean, I see and we see that trust is a big issue. Distrust is a big issue in democracy research. But also when we talk about democracy and democracy research today, we talk a lot about a crisis of democracy, and in fact, a polycrisis of democracy where multiple and interconnected challenges reinforce each other: political polarization, declining trust, misinformation, and the list goes on. So it's very commonplace today to talk about these different crisis problems of democracy. So what do you think? Is democracy research keeping up with the number of challenges democracy faces today? And when you think about your own research and the research that is being conducted in Australia or elsewhere, what recent developments in democracy research do you think are most useful or relevant to resolve these crises, to improve democracy in practice?
Yeah, when you go through the list of the crises, I mean, the answer is should probably be how can research keep up with all of these challenges? But I think actually the short answer is still yes. I think the research is keeping up with the crises, but that doesn't matter that it immediately solves them or has solutions, can present solutions that can be taken immediately into the policy space to solve a crisis. So there's more translation necessary. And I'm sure Alex can talk a lot about that, right? But I think, so there are important insights that help us address the crisis, from different fields. So psychology can tell us which disinformation intervention works best, when and why. Communication studies can tell us about how to better frame policy advocacy to address, the short-termism in policymaking, so to actually focus on the future. But when I look at my field, political science, I think the subfield that's most undervalued and has become so relevant now is authoritarian politics. That has huge relevance to the public crisis. So we just have to think about the fact that democracy as a regime that I described before in the US won't survive this year, for example. So we need the insights of our colleagues who study authoritarian regimes and have studied them for decades, because they can tell us how autocrats use institutions to share power, how they undermine institutions for their purpose, how democracy-minded people can organize and resist in a non-violent fashion. So there's a whole body, like a wealth of knowledge on this from authoritarian politics scholars. And I think that is something that could be more relevant today and needs to be brought to the forefront.
Yes, great insights. My final question to you, Max, is about the state of democracy research in Australia. You've been doing democracy research in Australia, but as I mentioned before, you're also doing comparative research. You've been doing democracy research in other contexts as well, which I find very, very valuable. And you're also, as an international scholar, so you're familiar with democracy research happening elsewhere in the States, in Europe, etc. So how would you describe the state of democracy research in Australia? And my specific question there is, do you think we are reluctant innovators in democracy research? Are we being too conservative, too radical? How would you describe the state of Australian scholars' research on Australian democracy?
Yeah, what a great question. I think it's vibrant. The community of scholars is vibrant. It's growing. Even since I started working 5 years ago in Australia, I think it has some very positive conditions in which it functions, and one of them is that policymakers actually pay attention and actively seek out knowledge from scholars. And I'm saying that, knowing that there is a resilient democracy network, that there are, that there is now an Office for Social Community Cohesion, etc. And I say that because I compare it to Germany, which is my home country, and I know the academic scene there, and there's just nothing at all comparable to that. So you're basically standing there shouting into the void as a scholar and hope that somebody picks it up. Australia has some mechanisms to translate research into where it matters. So that's on the plus side. And maybe negatively, or a bit more where there's room for improvement, I think democracy research in Australia can be a little bit inward looking, and not always being in direct conversation with international debates. And I see that especially on the methods side, I would say. Let me give you an example. Democracy scholars elsewhere use sort of cutting edge social science research methods like randomized experiments, agent-based modeling, or using large language models to code text at scale, large text corpuses. And these are things that are just making it into the Australian scene, so to speak, right? And I think it's it's not an end in and of itself to be at the cutting edge of democracy research methods, but the goal is to use these methods to produce relevant and impactful research. And experiments especially can do that because they tell you a great causal story. So I'm thinking of some of the work done here at the center in the Connect to Parliament project, where in an experiment, your colleagues were asking people about their perceptions of deliberative mini-publics. And through an experimental design, you can very confidently say that when they learn about a mini-public, then their legitimacy beliefs and their trust in the political system are increased. Mm-hmm. And that is a cause and effect relationship. So that's why I'm saying on the methods side, I think there is room to learn more from other countries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Max, and thanks for the shout out to our center's research on connecting to Parliament, which is led currently by Dr. Adele Webb at the center. So I am turning to the practice now, which hasn't been easier than this one, like just turning to my right side. And I have some questions for Alex, who brings very valuable insights from practice and from his involvement in many projects. So, Alex, we are talking about the connection between democracy research and practice. So from where you are sitting, what do you think about this connection? Is there a disconnect, or do you share Max's observation on kind of policymakers, decision makers paying attention to democracy research in Australia more than in other contexts? And my concrete question there is, do you think research-informed ideas, papers getting stuck in commissioned reports, roundtables, or in journal articles behind paywalls, or do they find their way to practice? So what are your thoughts on the connection and disconnection between research and practice?
Right, well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be back in a room of academics in an academic seminar. I can say, just to preempt this question. It is not often that I get to sit in this environment, so that may be a beginning response to your question, but it's definitely an enjoyable one. And I also just want to say that my comments today are mine as Alex Fischer, not on behalf of a department, particularly as we're in caretaker mode. I just want to be very clear that I'm speaking on a personal behalf. So I have reflected on that question for a couple of days and having, being slightly unusual in the sense that I have had an academic background, I've had a civil society career, and I've now had a public policy career. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question because I do see those connections and I rely on the types of knowledge products across an array of them that come out of universities, that come out of think tanks. But to answer your question, I think with some exemptions, the answer is largely no. I don't think there is a continual strong connection at a scale of issues that reinforce strong democracy. So across the variety of components that are required for democracy to be strong, I'm not sure that I see that ongoing connection between research and policymakers. What I think is that there are, first of all, a whole range of ways in which we use research and policy that look different depending on the part of the policy making or this, public service apparatus that you're involved with. But overall, I think often, I have Scopus searches that send me my weekly review of papers on democracy. I follow centers like yours. But I think at some level, researchers might be asking questions differently than the questions that are being asked within the conversations that are happening at the forefront of policy making or forefront of analysis that's happening in departments. Now, they're probably in the same family, the same kind of general area, but some of the ways in which those questions are formed and therefore the results that come with the research, the products that come from it might not necessarily be aligned. And they probably shouldn't be in many cases, but there probably are opportunities to better align the questions and the problems that are trying to be solved with the types of analysis and outputs that come from that work. So I was thinking as a prompt, what are the decisions that your work can support? When you're doing research, do you ask yourself, is the output of my research going to be able to support a decision, wherever that might sit in civil society or in policy making or the public service? If you can answer, if that's an easy yes, then great, you're on the right track. Then you just have the challenge of how you communicate it and make sure it's heard and integrated. But I would probably posit sometimes as researchers that question of how is this going to inform a point of decision making might not be at the forefront of how you design your research projects. I kind of categorize 3, maybe 4 areas, and this is really broad, but I'm interested in your thought. I think that there's how does research shape policy strategy? I think a lot of that's done around the monitoring systems, the trends analysis, the kind of framing of issues. There's another category which is probably around how do you use research to design policy and programs. It's probably more on the diagnostic side. There's probably another category around what kind of research and analysis do we need to do to understand what works for program delivery and implementation. And then on the way here, I was thinking there's probably another one, which there's probably many ways to slice and dice this, but there's probably a 4th one around how does research help hold systems accountable and push new ideas, push new frameworks and ways of thinking. Being here is a perfect example of how the center has pushed ideas around deliberative forms of democracy and helping to hold systems accountable.
Oh, that's a great list of opportunities to strengthen the ties between democracy research and practice. So I'm interested in the current efforts or the past efforts of the Australian government, and our center is familiar with the Strengthening Democracy Task Force, which was formed a couple of years ago, and we also joined the report launch, and we were happy to see our center's research being featured in the report as well. On deliberative democracy and democratic resilience. So can you tell us a bit about this task force and the kind of work that was done that led to the development of the report? And particularly, I think I'm interested in knowing what kind of research informed this work. And also, I'm interested in knowing what counts as valuable data in those kind of leading government documents. Like we are also, as a research institute, for example, we are always embracing and celebrating methodological pluralism. We think, we need all sorts of methods, not only one type. We need all sorts of data we could get to understand what's going on and to improve practice. But I'm interested in your thoughts, on the task force, the kind of research that informed task force work, and what do you think, if there is anything is missing there, and how it could be further improved?
Yeah, well, great. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the work, so I'll give a brief summary of it and then kind of reflect on this question. So several years ago, the incoming government set up a task force called the Strengthening Democracy Task Force. It emerged out of a variety of kind of recognitions. I think a lot of what Max talked about in terms of kind of growing recognition of pressures on democracy, but also a real appreciation for the historical legacies of Australians' innovation in the ways in which we practice democracy over time, many of which have been recognized globally, and in some of the recent historical work from historians, Judith, Brett, and others. So the task force was formed with an objective to understand the constellations of challenges facing democracy in Australia, and help set a practical agenda on how the government would think about responses at different timeframes. So in the early stages of the work, it was an effort from within government to assess the different trends, the different points of pressures, but also the points of historical strength in our institutions, in our culture, our social practices, and in our information systems, and how we, the narratives and the ways in which we create and share information across levels. So the report was what we hope to be kind of a framework to ask more questions. It lays out a very brief summary of kind of one framing of the history of the evolution of democracy in this country. It draws from a range of analysis that has been done from research centers, think tanks, government departments. We ran surveys with the Australian Public Service Commission looking at trust and satisfaction in democracy. It was, a single survey with a large sample size asking quite a large array. It's a public report. I hope you can all go and take a look at it. There's been some interesting secondary publications coming off the back of that, discussing different points that didn't make their main report. And then we really spent time trying to inventory where innovation was happening in Australia and why, and not just Australia, globally, actually. So the final portion of this is, it wasn't about setting out a series of recommendations saying this is what the government should be doing or what civil society should be doing. It said, across different sectors, if we are to strengthen democracy, we have interdependencies and reliances, and here are places where there have been innovative practices around the world. And I think really it was a prompting question for multiple sectors to say, what should we be doing and how should we be doing it? So what I hope comes out of that, from your kind of question on where the research fits in, it prompted me to, realize that there's a significant amount of research that happens that focuses on diagnosing the problem. We spend a lot of time on the descriptive side of analysis. There's a lot of resources, importantly, that go into understanding where there's different pressures and drivers. I would argue, and I'm happy, I know there are definitely outliers to this, including the work of the center, but there's less of a focus on how do we inform those who are innovating the practices of democracy. How do we give that, how do we give different organizations, initiatives, individuals, the types of information they need to be proactively thinking about what could change, what could evolve, how to practice, improve the practices or responsibilities they have within the democracy. So I think, by and large, that's one of the interesting gaps about how do we switch or evolve a frame of our overall research to include both the problem diagnostic, but also the what do we do to inform those who are trying to innovate practices at a range of different levels of functioning.
Thanks, Alex. So looking at the time, my final question to you is about the constraints, that the real world constraints that are stopping practitioners. I mean, based on your observation, doesn't necessarily have to be in government, but civil society as well. What are the real life constraints that practitioners face when they want to use more of research, or when they want to make their solutions more research informed? So how could we overcome these kind of obstacles to connect, to bridge the divide between research and practice, particularly in Australia? So from your perspective, what do you think, what can be done?
Probably won't tell you too much of what you don't already know in terms of what the constraints are, but how we respond to them might be interesting. So I mean, I think if you've had a job in policy, you realize that the timeframes are quite different to those in research. You understand that, I think you mentioned even one of them, access to information, access to the primary, infrastructure that enables academic and research discussions are published papers. Policymakers generally don't have access to that. I think what I've found is that there has been challenges in how and I think this is an interesting one for researchers in general, like often academics aren't motivated to do translational pieces off the back of academic publications. It takes so long to get a piece through a peer-reviewed journal. When you get to that point, particularly for the incentives within the system, that's often the point at which you're on to your next project, you've already forgotten about that one, et cetera. You are not thinking about how do I then take this 2 more steps further to make this work relevant and accessible to policymakers.
Yeah.
And then, well, oftentimes I would say those papers, have either missed the moment of policy relevance, or when that moment reemerges in the policy cycle, you're not thinking about that. So you're not sitting there saying, let me send a summary of this paper 3 years later to the Office of Community Cohesion in government. You've moved on. And so I think there's kind of for me, what would be really helpful is thinking about how do we build, an academic language is probably collective intelligence systems, or practically, I think these ideas of living evidence systems. And as someone who sat in civil society as well, accessing that knowledge set when you need it is really hard. So how do you maintain a living, dynamic evidence network? That can't just be a single university. I think that's also the challenge. The issues cut across expertise. Every university has different forms of expertise. It's interdisciplinary. How do you set up that type of ongoing living infrastructure so that when, there's something happens and all of a sudden there has to be got 1 week to design a policy response to whatever the issue is, you're able to access the best information. I think I've gone to Max before asking for help. How do I design questions on mistrust and distrust if I'm going to run a survey really rapidly? But it can't rely on my or a policymaker's individual knowledge of other individual researchers. There has to be a way. I think the ChatGPT functions and the ways in which we can access information, in new searchable forms might start to shift that, but that depends on the accessibility of the content that is being produced by researchers, and that I still think is a barrier that someone will overcome at some point, but is not in the near term.
Do you think policymakers use platforms like Google Scholar to search for the publications, insights?
They do, but the type of insights you need to draw from those papers then require more time to read the articles, synthesize out what you need. Well, first of all, identify which articles are probably the most relevant and the leading ones, which takes a certain type of expertise that I think you get if you've come out of a research background, but you don't necessarily get if you're, and then you have to go that next step. So unless you as a center or you as a school or you as an individual have provided a perfect policy relevant statement that matches what I'm looking for, you just think like, you don't have the time to sit there and do that. And so that's where I think we either need networks of access or the types of chat GPT functions that can help you find it faster.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks, Alex. So we're running out of time a bit, and it's wonderful to hear your insights. As mentioned before, I'm going to invite you to ask a question to each other based on what you heard, and then we will open the floor. So Max, maybe first to you. So what is your one question to Alex?
Yeah, I mean, listening to the constraints that exist and the misalignment from both ends, practitioner and the scholarly side, I think my question would be, what do I have to do to really have a policymaker in a ministry pay attention to my research, like given the constraints, because I'm failing at it. So any advice? Because that would be exactly the leap that's necessary, right?
I think that there's, again, I don't know how to do this, but I think an ongoing conversation that allows policymakers and academics to come either to forums like this or something that's perhaps, the three of us have been working with this network, which is still in its early phases. So, a network of scholars, civil society, and government. I think, it's an interesting one because sometimes what you probably need is the ability for a policymaker to say, hey, this is my current policy dilemma. Here's the question I'm asking. And then for you to say, okay, well, here's the body of research I've done and here's how it's related, versus saying, here's my latest paper, listen to me on this great idea I have. Because, as I've said, there's could be mistimed, it could be, it could be the keywords aren't right to catch the attention. There's 1,000 reasons why that might not catch the attention. But I do think there are, again, huge moment. There's a lot of examples in which, people, academics and researchers with expertise are trusted supports for policymakers. And there are plenty of mechanisms in government that do set that up in an ongoing way. I guess responding to you as, if you're not in that role already, how do you make your research relevant? And I think it's, figuring out how you're having a conversation with policy versus, and incorporating that into your study design up front, not dominating it, because you've got academic interests that should always sit as, a core of that.
Alex, your question to Max.
Yeah, I mean, I'm first of all, congratulations on your linkage and ARC grant. That's always an exciting moment. And I guess the question I have is, as you are designing that, how did you think about the end users in a policy or service? One of I know there's a range of different agencies that you're working with. How did you think about the design of that work to have relevance to those agencies?
Yeah, I don't think we've cracked it, honestly, but there were a few things that we did consider in the Trust project, which has engaged with the AEC, the National Anti-Corruption Commission, etc. And so one big shift was to think not in social science terms, what causes why, like some outcome of interest, but think also the other way around, is X effective in making Y better? And I think the second way of thinking is more immediately translatable. So is anything that we will study going to answer that question? Is truth in political advertising going to improve trust, right? Rather than what causes trust. Could be a million things. That's how we usually think. But I have to say, despite all the constraints, I do think that the incentives in Australia are better aligned than elsewhere, quite honestly, just because I've seen how bad it can be. You are asked as a researcher in the ARC process to demonstrate that you address the national interest, that you have identified beneficiaries of your research, and how you will communicate the results. So that's a starting point to, I think, force you to think, can I convene an impact workshop where those people who would benefit from the research can actually come and interactively discuss the results, etc. Things like that are super important.
Yeah, ARC applications are designed to actually, ideally, to bridge the divide between research and practice. The questions we have to answer there are very useful. Great. So